Hey there, everybody, and welcome, and thank you for tuning in. Sorry if you all came at 1 o'clock for the 7-minute sort of delay for that, but I appreciate your patience, and we're thankful that you're here joining us. This is Nico here at Breakaway, and we're delighted that you all could join us for the fourth installment of the Active Citizen Speaker Series. We have staff and students watching from Breakaway chapter schools, as well as Alternative Breaks alumni. For those of you who may be viewing our series for the first time, the Active Citizen Speaker Series is a way to bring together community and world leaders with Alternative Breakers alumni and the colleges and universities we work with. So you could even say that it's our chance to highlight the movers and shakers of our world in government, nonprofits, and community organizing. So with this call, this past summer, we hosted one of our Alternative Break citizenship schools in Columbus, Ohio, focusing on new Americans. We worked closely with the city of Columbus there to learn how they're building a welcoming community for immigrants and refugees who are relocating to the city. And at that conference, we drew heavily on David Lubell's work. So it should come as no surprise that we were eager to share this conversation with him today. David is a renowned advocate, organizer, and social entrepreneur who also founded Welcoming America. There now, he's the executive director of the organization. So you all know that we define an active citizen as someone who sees community as a priority in their values and life choices. And David and his organization are leading the charge on actualizing one for what we as long-term residents can do to ensure our community is a welcoming one for new Americans. An active citizen in his own right, we are excited to have David Lubell with us. So David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Nico, and thanks to everybody who's joining. Appreciate you all having me. Did you want me to introduce Welcoming America?
Yeah, David, if you would be able to, if you could give us some background on Welcoming America, your work, and what brought you into working with new Americans, that'd be great.
Sure. Sorry about that. So thank you again for having me. So Welcoming America is a nationwide, actually starting to become a global organization, nonprofit organization, and we help communities across the country really become fully welcoming to immigrants. And so when we say welcoming, that means, how do you create a culture in a community that is fully welcoming? So when a newcomer comes to the community, they know whoever they first come into contact with, that person can understand that immigrants are something, and refugees are a value to that community. So the culture of welcoming, and also policies and institutions that are welcoming in a community. So we work with municipal governments and other partners to try to make sure the policies and programs of a community make sure that the barriers that immigrants sometimes face in other communities are not nearly as high in welcoming communities. If you want to start a business, if you want to get your kid into school, whatever barriers that often immigrants and refugees face, and we want to make sure those are as low as possible so that everybody in a community can reach their full potential. So I mean, it's a long story how I got started doing this work. I do have a connection to service. I first started doing social justice work after actually a middle school teacher brought me to a homeless shelter. I grew up in Philadelphia. And at that shelter, I became friends with the families there and the kids there, and really saw that I wanted to do something to make everyone have more opportunities. And it was about fairness for me, because I didn't understand why some people, I had been given more opportunities, and the people I was meeting in the shelter really had a lot less opportunities. Since then, I lived in Ecuador for a year after college. I did that so I could do more organizing in the immigrant community. Spanish is very useful, and I didn't speak it. I took French in high school. And I eventually made my way to Tennessee, where first I started the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, which is still an organization that's going strong in Tennessee. But from Turk, that's the acronym, I started Welcoming America, which was based on a program we started in Tennessee called Welcoming Tennessee. And the idea of Welcoming Tennessee was, pretty simple. It was, we were doing a lot of work to help immigrants and refugees with job training, language skills, but we weren't helping everyday Tennesseans adjust to the changing demographics in their communities, and that was leading to all sorts of problems. And we talk about this analogy of a seed in the soil. So if you think of an immigrant or refugee as a seed being put into a community or into a garden, if the soil is not fertile, you can provide English classes and all those types of things. It's like pouring water on the seed. But if the soil isn't fertile, if everyday people and the institutions in a community aren't welcoming and aren't there to really provide that support, the plant's just not going to grow as well. Immigrants and refugees are not going to be as successful. And again, that's detrimental to everybody in a community. So we started with Tennessee. The work there went really, really well. We went from Tennessee being, or Nashville being one of the most anti-immigrant cities in the country due to a backlash that took place after a large growth in its immigrant population in the late 90s and early 2000s, to becoming one of the most welcoming cities in the country. An example of how far we came by 2014, 2006 we started Welcoming Tennessee. By 2014, President Obama flew me on Air Force One to Nashville to make a speech. There he made a speech about Nashville being a model of a city that came to grips with immigration, really wrestled with it, had dialogues in communities, brought people together, and came out the other side seeing the value of immigrants and making them welcome, and making that a model for the entire country. And Nashville gained economically and socially. And a lot of our communities, when I say our communities around the country, we have about 100 that are part of our network. And those 100 plus communities are living this model of creating welcoming culture for everybody, welcoming institutions, and also demonstrating how that benefits everybody. So we have lots of examples. Another example of a place that benefited, Dayton, Ohio. I know some of the people on this call are from Ohio. Dayton was losing population until they started their Welcome Dayton plan. And that was led by the municipal government, by nonprofit leaders. They spent a year doing planning around what it would mean to be welcoming. And since then, since launching Welcome Dayton in Dayton, they're not losing population, they're gaining population, and they're gaining tax base. And they have business districts that were really doing poorly or boarded up that are now thriving. And it's just one of many, many examples of what happens when you make everybody in your community count, and you make sure that they can be successful. It benefits them, benefits everybody. And I love doing work like that. So I'm really lucky to be able to spend my days building welcoming communities.
Yeah, thanks, David, for sharing that. That's amazing, especially that sort of Air Force One bit that where you got to meet with the president. He sort of honored the work that you were doing and what Nashville has become as sort of this model for welcoming communities. That's really exciting to hear. That's great. Well, now we're going to go ahead and sort of move on to the question and answer portion. I know a lot of you submitted questions when you RSVP'd for this call. So if you have any questions from what David just said or any questions that came up, feel free to email us at breakaway@alternativebreaks.org, or you could chat us on Facebook, and we'll do our best to include them at any point during the rest of the call. But our first one is from Mike at Vanderbilt University. And David, he's asking, what impact has Welcoming America seen from the politicization of the Syrian refugee crisis and increasingly polarizing rhetoric around legal Mexican immigration?
First of all, I didn't go to Vanderbilt, but I have a special place in my heart for it because it is in Nashville, where I lived for many years. And so, go Vanderbilt. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's the question of the hour. And it has differing effects on our work. And first of all, for anybody who cares about the issue of welcoming, this is a big moment for all of us. Millions and millions of people are fleeing for their lives, and what is a community going to do about that? What is a country going to do about that? And so, we've had many people come to us and support us in ways that they never have before because they feel the urgency of this historical moment, and they want to do something to support Syrian refugees and to support refugees in general. But the idea of refugees being vilified when, for fleeing for their lives, it doesn't fit the values of our country. And there's a lot of people who have responded to that and have responded to some of the vitriol with a desire to push something much more consistent with their values, which is the idea of welcoming. So in some ways, it's helped us gain volunteers. It's helped us raise money. It's helped us get a lot of momentum. But it also, it's frustrating, and the rhetoric, the rhetoric affects us. Some communities get scared by that rhetoric. Most of our communities have just stood up and said, no, we're going to move forward. And so yeah, I mean, it affects the national debate more than it affects our communities, but it's not to say that it doesn't affect our communities. I'd say one other thing around that is it affects everyday people. I mean, in Michigan, for example, where we work a lot, some of the rhetoric there has just made people who felt welcome their whole lives in Michigan feel unwelcome. Refugees and other people, the Muslim community with all the rhetoric that's happening. We can't let that happen. Everybody in this country needs to feel a part of this country like they belong. That's what we're all about as a nation. So it's a moment, and it galvanizes us. It creates challenges, but it also creates, wind at our back in a lot of ways.
Yeah, thanks, David. I appreciate a lot of sort of what you were saying around what it means, our values as Americans and the values that we stand for in our country. That was really thoughtful, and it really provided a lot of thinking behind what we stand for and how we really need to act on it. Our next question is actually from Adrian at Northwestern, and she's asking sort of how we stand in the international community, America compared to other countries in the rest of the world, and our sentiments. So she's asking specifically, does the anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment in the United States seem to be unique to this nation? And how do our collective attitudes or beliefs compare or contrast with nationalism and xenophobia in other countries?
It's a great question also. So it's definitely not, it's not unique to the United States. I mean, I've been traveling this year. I've been to Switzerland, I've been to Germany, I've been to Australia even already. It's only April. And it's happening in all those places, and it's happening all over the world. And in some ways, it's part of human nature to have some fear of change. And right now, you're seeing with a lot of people on the move, and again, people are afraid because of things like entities like ISIS, and so fear is normal. It's really a question of what do countries do with that, and so in Europe, I'd say the some of the backlash has been worse even than the United States. In the United States, you have presidential candidates, for example, that are using rhetoric. But there are political parties in Europe, far-right parties that are gaining real power in the political system, and are creating policies that are pretty scary in some of the countries in Europe. And so in some ways, the rhetoric and the actual policies are worse in some parts of Europe than here. And it's even in places that Turkey's taking in a lot of immigrants, and Jordan. You hear about some of the anti-immigrant sentiment in those places as well. So it's partially human nature, and in order to overcome human nature, our receiving communities work, or any work that you do around immigrant integration that focuses also on what we call the receiving community, which is long-term residents, is really important, and it's usually forgotten. And it's part of that seed in the soil analogy that I talked about earlier. So Turkey needs a strategy for engaging receiving communities and addressing the fears that they might have, because a lot of this is just around fear, fear of the other. And if that fear is not addressed, then people can end up voting for the far right in Switzerland instead of not, or worse types of activities or behaviors. So it's not unique to the United States, but we need to address it here in the United States. And it's some of the rhetoric presidential candidates is being heard around the world, and that's frustrating because in general we have a good reputation when it comes to immigration around the world, but that's being challenged now.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's so important about how you were identifying the root cause of all of this is sort of this fear of the other and otherizing people who are different than us. Something that we're noticing, not just here, I don't think internationally, but also like we're seeing how the students that we're working with are trying to address that in their own campuses, and even with their own friends and relationships that they've built. Thanks, David. Our next question is actually from an alternative breaker at the University of Delaware. Jason was saying that he used some of the content from the toolkits available on your website to frame the education for his alternative break trip. So as they were transitioning back from their trip and applying those lessons learned, that he was struggling to communicate some of this experience to his families. Do you all, as Welcoming America, have any tools or resources to engage in dialogue with family or friends who may not have that same sort of orientation to new American populations and perhaps have a sense of fear rooted in as well?
It's a great question because it's often hardest to talk to our own families about these issues. Because I mean, anytime you have a difficult conversation, it's scarier if something's at stake, and nothing is more valuable than our relationships with our families. I have my in-laws, for example, don't share all of my opinions politically, and certainly not always on immigration. And so sometimes I feel confident that I can have those conversations, and sometimes I don't. Depends on a lot of different factors. We have on our website a dialogue toolkit that was developed by the Public Conversations Project, which is an organization that does conflict resolution in conflict zones in Africa and other parts of the world, as well as helping with dialogue here in the United States. So if they can help in conflicts, live conflicts in war zones in the rest of the world, should be able to help with your family as well. So I would recommend that tool. There's just certain things you do at the beginning of a dialogue to kind of get people prepared even before you start talking about it that are really important. That's something I learned from that development of that toolkit when we worked with them. But we also have people here who can be helpful. I think everybody would know our website's welcomingamerica.org. You can email info@welcomingamerica.org, and we can get you to the right person, or you can go on the website to figure out if you want to talk to somebody like Jennifer, who does our curricula. And all our emails are Jennifer@welcomingamerica.org. I'm David@welcomingamerica.org. But start with that resource. Understand that those family conversations or friend conversations have a lot at stake and are difficult, but don't shy away from them, because you'll actually feel closer to the person by being vulnerable and actually talking about these important issues.
Great. Yeah, thanks, David. That's comforting to know that the same resources that they could use when talking with politicians or business leaders could also be used with their friends and family. That's great. So Allery from the College of Charleston asks, which city that you all work with has had the most success with welcoming communities, and what are you seeing that they're doing really well?
It's a great question, but a very difficult question to answer. Plus, I can't answer it because then all the other cities will be jealous. I'll give a couple examples of places.
You can play favorites, that's fair.
I mean, I will say we have different sort of prototypical cities that kind of represent, there's different types of cities that we think of around welcoming. Nashville is an example of many cities that have had a rapid growth in their immigrant population, and it's kind of trying to deal with those tensions that result from that. And so Nashville is a great example if you're in a kind of city or town that has had a rapid growth. I know some people have watched Welcome to Shelbyville, that film that was roughly based on our work in Shelbyville. Shelbyville is a town of about 20,000 in Tennessee. If you're from a smaller town, that's a great example of a place, a small town that was wrestling with these issues and managed to really change the climate for the better. And Dayton is a good example for a place that's that was losing population. We have a whole network of communities in the Rust Belt, Rust Belt, post-industrial belt. Pittsburgh is another great example, but you can look at the We Global Network, which is a network that we work on with an organization called Global Detroit. We have a whole number of cities in that kind of category. But any community that's successful, be Nashville, be Dayton, be Pittsburgh, be whatever, they planned. And so planning is so important. You don't just kind of you don't want to just react to the changing demographics or react to the fact that you're losing population. You want to plan. And Dayton spent a whole year talking to everybody in the community, not every single person, but as many stakeholders as possible in the development of their plan. And when you plan, you really think about, okay, what are the barriers that we can address here? What are the concerns the general community has? What can we do to address the cultural challenges? So every community that was successful, committed to it, had, ideally you have the municipal and government involved at some point because they can be very helpful. You brought together a multi-sector collaborative, which obviously should include universities. Any successful collaborative has university partners as well as municipal partners, as well as other nonprofit business partners. But that multi-sector piece is really important. The planning piece is really important. And execution is important too. So having people who can get things done is always important. But you can start from anywhere. Some of our initiatives start in churches, church basements. Some start at City Hall. Some start in a nonprofit, development office complex. But they all start somewhere. But if you have the right people together and you're ready to plan, you can accomplish anything.
Yeah, thanks, David. You were just mentioning sort of the inclusion of universities into this process and how they could easily do that as well. I'm sure this is something that a lot of our viewers and a lot of the colleges and universities we work with and the students there are curious, but what could they do to either ensure their campus community or their town or city is a welcoming community, or help make that as part of the process or plan towards that?
Sure. So, I mean, there's two areas. It's both the university itself and then the broader community. So the broader community is what we focus more on. And like I said, you can, a student, and I was an advocate activist student. I started organizations when I went to Wesleyan University many years ago. But students can say, we want to make the community where our university is welcoming, and say, okay, let's. And I was at Wesleyan recently talking to somebody from a church leader, some students, about how they might go about doing that in Middletown, Connecticut. But we have a great community planning guide that they're using to think about how to start planning for making Middletown a welcoming community. Again, we have staff, people that can help with that. So that there's the way that students and faculty can actually move a whole community towards welcoming. And then there's the idea of making your campus more welcoming, and that starts. We have this receiving communities toolkit that would be useful for that. But the starting of making your campus welcoming is thinking about, again, what kind of a culture exists in your campus, and what could be done to bring immigrants and longtime residents. For example, a lot of universities have gotten large number of people from China or other parts of of Asia that are that aren't always finding it as easy to integrate. What could be done in that instance? So there's a lot of things that can be done on campus. We're going to be certifying cities shortly. We're not going to be certifying universities in the near future, but we'd love to talk to universities that want to experiment with this idea. So if you want to experiment with, if you're listening and you want to experiment with this idea, we'd love to talk to you about it. Oh, actually, Deborah, my colleague Deborah just reminded me of an important thing. We also have National Welcoming Week once a year in September. There's information on our website about this, but it's an amazing event, and we'll have now this year people from all over the world participating. But that's another great way to just get your feet wet. It's basically just hosting events, 1 event, 2 events, 3 events at your university, in your community, where immigrants and refugees and long-term residents come together in some way to celebrate the idea of welcome. whether it be a soccer tournament or having a potluck dinner together, or having a swearing-in ceremony for new citizens, and we can give you 100 other ideas. But it's a great way to start an effort in a community, and I highly recommend that everybody at least do that. Look into it now and plan to do a welcoming week event in September.
Yeah, thanks, David. Whether it be something as starting a welcoming week on your campus or starting the process of seeing what your campus community could contribute to as being a welcoming community and working more closely with Welcoming America, we'll have those tools available on our website of how you can connect and get in contact with Welcoming America for that. But David, thank you so much for sharing ways that they can get involved. And even though currently we're just looking at welcoming cities, it's exciting to see that campuses and universities could be a part of this and that students can sort of be moving the charge on ensuring their own campuses and the communities and towns that they're in could be just as welcoming too. So thank you everybody for joining us. I know we're a little bit over, but David, thank you especially for taking the time out of your day to share your message of welcoming communities, the sort of state that we're in with new Americans in the United States and what we're moving towards and what Welcoming America is really doing to push forward in that regard. We're truly appreciative for that. And we're happy that you can join the ranks of past active citizen speakers. But for everybody else, stay tuned for an announcement on the fall speaker series. We'll be back here talking about things that matter. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.